Hey team, welcome everyone on to the domain number 5, and in this we are going to talk about a very important topic for your CISSP, CISM, CRISC, all these kind of exams, and this is very testable in the exam. So we are going to touch upon on access control models. So in access control in IAM, right, you always know there are three things: authentication, authorization, and accounting. AAA, that is the base concept on which the entire access controls are based on. Any kind of active directory, any kind of authentication system, let it be SailPoint, Okta, whatever these kind of tools, right, they're all based on these three things, right? So authentication is a separate topic. We will talk about that separately in some other video. In this, the second part here is authorization, and the third part is all about accounting. That also we'll talk about some other time, but the focus for this video is authorization. And authorization has to be properly thought of, who is going to be given what kind of access, and it should be very consistent across the company. Now to do that, you need to plan it better, and there are certain models as well for the same thing. So in this video, we are going to talk about different access control models, which we are going to talk about. Primarily, we are going to talk about role-based access controls. We are going to talk about attribute-based access control. We are also going to talk about risk-based access control, right? On the other side, we are also going to talk about or start our communication with something called as mandatory access control and discretionary access controls. So let me take them one by one so that your concepts are clear. I am going to talk about MAC first. What is mandatory access control? Mandatory access control. So one thing is for sure, whenever you are talking about mandatory access control or discretionary access control, you need to think it from a system perspective. That means different people are logged onto the same system and it's a multi-user machine. How you're going to control access to that particular machine when there are different people with different clearance level, they are going to access the same machine. And same goes in with different kind of processes also which are there on the system. Not every system or not every process on the system is trusted with the equal trust. There are certain processes which are trusted less. There are certain processes which are trusted more. For example, in an operating system, the kernel file are trusted more. Whereas any kind of program you download, which you just install on your computer, that is trusted less. So always, I have told you in domain number 3 as well, there is a ring type of architecture. It's a conceptual architecture which we need to understand. So now, where do we implement mandatory access control and what it is? A mandatory access control is a type of control where the access is mandatory. Means, let's say there are 5 users logged onto the same system, okay? All of these 5 users, right, will be going through the same set of policies which are implemented on the system level, okay? There is nothing on the discretion of each and every user. It is not on the discretion of the user. It is not in the hands of the user. If you are not permitting a particular level of user for something, he cannot do that. So this central policy has to be enforced by the central system administrator, and then the same policy get applied to all of it. That's a mandatory access control. And by the thought itself, it looks like more of a rigid kind of control, very rigid. There is no flexibility, and whatever you have a central policy is going to be applied for all of them, right? Now, have you seen any such kind of system in your life? Actually, yes and no, because normally we are not in a habit of seeing these kind of system, but actually within your operating system, how the access is being taken care by the reference monitor. So reference monitor, which is a very core concept of authentication, which is the main element who is doing the authentication, is usually based on mandatory access control, right? Apart from this, let's say there is a cloud architecture, and that is where you have a lot of users actually who are logged in onto one system or maybe on one platform, and you don't want that there should be any kind of deviation. Everybody has to be separately kept, and you need to strictly maintain a common set of control across that. So that is also where we implement mandatory access control, right? These kind of controls usually are more popular in the military organization and the government organizations as well, because that is where you are more focused about confidentiality of it. If you want to relate it a further step better, you can also relate this mandatory access control with something called as Bella Padula and Biba integrity model. So those kind of models are also closely tied up. They are integrated component when we are implementing the mandatory access control. So few things you need to understand from the exam perspective. Mandatory access controls are mandatory. It is not based on discretion, and whatever the system policies are defined centrally, that get applied to everyone on the system. So that's your mandatory access control. Then there is also something called as discretionary access controls. Okay, now these kind of controls are basically based on a thought process that we are going to trust the user. We are going to trust the user, and let's say there is a system and there are two users logged in on top of it, number one and number two, and number one user has created, let's say, a file, let's say XYZ, and number two has created a file, let's say ABC. Then it is on the discretion of that particular user, because he is the owner. He is the owner of that particular file. So a creator is automatically becoming a owner of that particular file. So this file can be shared to anyone on the discretion of this user number one, right? And when he is going to share it, he can also share a read access or a write access or an execute access as well. So any level of access can be defined based on the discretion of the user. You are witnessing this day in and day out when you are logging onto your system and you are the creator of a particular file, and then you just right click and share it with somebody else. So you have the authority to do it. So that's called as a discretionary access control system. Okay, but till now, very important thing is, whenever we talk about mandatory access control, whenever we are talking about discretionary access control, we are talking about the access control on a system which is handled by multiple users. What about your corporate itself? What about your enterprise itself? What kind of access control we have in your enterprise itself? Let's say you recently joined a company and you want to set up a proper authentication and authorization method. What you are going to follow? So most of the organizations. Yeah, go ahead, sir. Go ahead.
Can we say that the discretionary access control is totally dependent upon the data owner's decision?
Yeah, it is the owner who is logged in. That's, let's say a user A has logged in. This data relates to user A, and he is the owner of that particular file, so he can share it with anybody he wants.
Okay, so basically data owner.
See, don't relate it with data owner, because that data owner, otherwise you will go to domain 2 and start tagging it as data owner. That will be a wrong mapping. That data owner is a role in a particular company. Now here we are talking about a user. He can be anybody. He can be anybody. Let's say a guest user by itself. If he is coming on a system and he created a guest user, has created a file, he can share it. The data roles in domain number 2, they are little different from that. That is more about the internal company roles, who is responsible for a particular type of data set. For example, when it comes to HR, the HR head is accountable for all data related to HR, right? It is from that
Correct.
perspective. Here we are talking about access control perspective. So that's a little bit of fine line.
Okay, understand.
Okay, great. Okay, so we were talking about when you are in a company and you need to set up security, you need to set up access controls now. So what is the best strategy which companies ever follow? You might see in companies a particular analyst may have access to their own payroll, but the manager may have the access to payroll for all the team members. How is that kind of made possible? That is all by role based access control. How do we implement it? So when we say role based access control, it is the access control is completely based on roles. And when it is implemented, right, how we need to implement role based access control. So in that we define two things. Number first is the role. Now, there's a difference between the term designation and a role. A director might be a designation, but what he is expected to do on a normal basis as part of his daily routine at work, that is something we are referring to as role. So, on that way, we are going to define the different roles we have in our company and the related activities so that you know for doing this activity what kind of access you need, what kind of files you need, what kind of system access you need, what kind of application access you need. So the first thing you are going to define is a role. The second thing which you also need to define is something called as groups, or you can call it as departments as well. Okay, so how does it work? See, in companies, normally we have hierarchy, right? There are normal users, then there are, let's say, team lead, and there is going to be managers, then there are going to be directors, and all of this, they have different roles, responsibilities. So based on that, we are defining certain groups, right? Say this is director group, this is manager group, this is team lead group, this is normal user group. So that way we define these kind of roles. Now, when a particular person is a director, let's say from IT, there might be a equivalent director, let's say in accounts as well. There might be a equivalent director in some other department, let's say legal as well. So can we keep access the same for all of these people? In some cases, on a constant level, we need to give them certain access because all of these people should be able to see the payrolls for people below them. So that is something common which we can keep common. But if a system relates to only IT, should a legal guy see this? At all? No, that's not what we want. So in that case, what we need to do, we need to also segregate them as per the groups or department, or maybe different kind of grouping. Let's say for leadership there is a one group, and for other people there is another group. Maybe for vendors there is a separate group, and for partners there is a separate group. So this actually creates some kind of mesh, right? If you see, this creates some kind of mesh, and this mesh gives you a very good control on who need to have access to what. Then based on that, we are going to create these as group. So these becomes our group. So we form groups based on this, and then the privileges which are defined, right, they are defined on the group level, not on the user level. What we just have to do, we just have to let's say we have created a particular group and we have provided access to that particular group, some kind of privileges a normal role should have in that particular group, and then it is just a matter of adding or removing people from that group. So there is something called as inheritance. So all these particular privileges are automatically assigned to these people. This provides a lot of advantage to any company because it becomes super simple for administrator to manage it. Otherwise, they would have to go to each and every user to, let's say, define 20 different access to different files, and that is more error prone system. So instead of doing that in one single activity, we have defined, let's say we have created an Excel sheet, what roles we have, and then we have defined what different departments and groups, whatever you want to have, we have, and then based on that you actually create something, this kind of structure, and based on that you create different roles, let's say in your Active Directory or wherever on the access control system you want to have it, and then just provide privileges to these groups, and then just keep adding and removing the user from there. Very, very simple model. So any kind of mid-size company and large size company, this is the perfect model which actually works for. So that is basically your role-based access control. Now here is a catch as well. If you are defining this role-based access control too much granular, right, you define it too much granular, then it require more resources to manage all of it, and there might be more, you can say, it will require a lot of resources from the team to do. So we are also making sure that we are not defining these kind of roles to a very, very fine grained level. Otherwise maintaining these kind of groups will be different, it will be difficult. Right, so that's something which you have to take care of when it comes to role-based access control. So in your present company you might already be seeing role-based access control, which is kind of a very popular model nowadays. However, everything has its good and bad. So role-based access control is something good to have a properly organized access control, controlling the privilege of the people and all of it. But let's say I give you an example. There is a company who have already implemented role-based access control. But after that as well, they see a lot of incident happening from different parts. Let's say Mr. A is logged in at some given point of time, let's say 7:18 a.m. and at 7:20 a.m. this guy is logging from India, and at 7:20 the same guy is logging from US. Right? Sometimes he is trying to access from his official laptop. Sometimes he is going to access from a particular device which is not recognized by the company, which is not managed by the company. So don't you think there are some kind of risk even there, even after that as well? This is a very common scenario where just implementing role-based access control may also have these kind of incidents which come in. So we need to have something on top of role-based access control which can further granularly go and control these kind of environment. So these are nothing but something is based on context. These are something which is based on context. So in the context-based access control system, there are certain more categories which we are going to talk about. The first one out of that is attribute-based access control. We call it as attribute because it talks about what, why, when, where, how. All these are the kind of attributes. So let's say you log in onto a particular portal and you have provided the right user name and the user password, and after that the system is asking you for another level of multi-factor authentication, or even if multi-factor authentication is not there, it is still able to disallow you the access. Why? Because the attribute based access control works on top of role based access control.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
Go ahead, sir. In the last slide, as you told that, in the last slide, can you show the last slide, sir?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, here you told that, sir, it's a role-based, that user can log in from India or US. But why role-based in organization? What if...
No. Until this point, it is role-based. Role-based manages different groups so that you can give them access to, let's say, 10 different applications and all of it. But what I am telling is, even after having role-based access control, you might have people you might have security incidents. Let's say a particular user has logged in at 7:18 from India and then 7:20 from US. So this is not foolproof, right? That is what I was trying to say. If it is not foolproof, it means we need to have some additional controls or additional access control which actually based on context. And for adding that context thing is what we are discussing about attribute-based access control, which are just not based on role-based, because role-based we have already implemented. This actually works on attributes, which talks about what, why, when, where, and all of it. And then when we do it, let's say you just, even if you log in, you have a correct login here, login credentials you have provided, even after that, the system might ask you for additional authentication, or system may directly disallow you the access to certain things. So how does it happen? It all happens based on attributes. So in the configuration part, we are defining, what means, who is the user, what device he is going to use, from where he is going to access, like location. We also say when he want to access, at what time. Let's say you only want people to access your company resources from morning 9 to 5 o'clock. After that, you don't want that people should have access. You can define those kind of rules as well here in attribute based. Okay, and how means how you are going to access. Are you going to access from the recognized device? Are you going to access it through VPN, or are you going to access it from, let's say, your BYOD, bring your own device? So based on that also, you can define rules in the backend, and these policies may get dynamically applied. These kind of rules will get dynamically applied when you actually go and try to log in. So that is called as your attribute based access control. So we are defining certain, you can say, policies based on your attributes. Okay, and these attributes policy will get dynamically applied based on the kind of configurations and the criteria you have set. So that's what, like for example, very normal, right? When you go and try to access your Gmail account from a different device, not your regular device, it might ask you for additional authentication, right? So that is one glimpse of access control system. But because Gmail is completely a cloud-based system, it is completely based on cloud, it actually also keeps a risk assessment of you. And we are going to talk about that in the next section. So I hope this attribute-based access control is clear to you. Now, on top of attribute-based access control, because in attribute-based, the entire decision is going to happen based on the attributes you define. Can we take this thing to a very different level? Answer is yes. And how it is possible? Because most of us are now on cloud. Most of the systems are now on cloud. So cloud is actually giving you as a native solution for all this, and they call it as risk-based access control. It looks like primarily looks like attribute-based access control, but it is more than that. And what is that more part? So let me tell you. In attribute-based access control, we are just checking what, why, when, where, how, all those parameters, right? Now in risk-based access control, right? Risk-based access controls, we just don't depend on these. In addition to these, we are also performing a risk assessment. Now, how this risk assessment is performed? This is automatically done by the system on cloud. Okay, so they are keeping a history of yours. For example, all the time you log in normally at morning 8 o'clock and you log in from India, let's say in Bangalore. But the moment they see you log in from somewhere else, because they already have your history, they already have your pattern, and the moment they see a change in the pattern, they are going to either throw you a multi-factor authentication request, or they are going to tag you as a risky user. So your admin will get a prompt that we have identified certain risky user, and based on the context and other thing, the administrator can decide either to disable the access or change the password or whatever, because in such kind of cases it is very likely that the password may have got compromised as well, right? So we don't want to take chances. So whenever you go on cloud, most of the time you will find risk-based access controls which are implemented. So this was a quick glance of this entire thing. All these access control systems actually works based on rules, and these rules can be static and dynamic. Okay, so when we define these static rules, it can be also access control list or access control matrix also, which we define, and most of your let's say your MAC, mandatory access control and kind of systems, they come under static rules. On the other side, the dynamic rules, we also have some certain rules, and additionally we might do some additional calculations, but these policies are getting centrally applied when we actually are in the real time scenario. So based on a particular user in a real time, the policy may decide either we have to put a MFA to this guy, or we have to allow this particular guy, or we have to deny this particular guy. So this was in a nutshell about mandatory access controls. Then we discussed about discretionary access control, which is based on the discretion of the user. We have discussed about role-based access control. We have discussed about attribute-based access control, and then risk-based access control. Most testable in your exam is going to be your role-based access control. So expect a lot of questions from this area.